Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and on this episode, I am pumped to have Evan Miyakawa on the show. He has his Ph.D. in statistics from Baylor. He's a college basketball analytics expert, and you can find all of his insights at evanmia.com. Evan, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Ed. And no better time of year to be talking some college basketball. We're basically a week away from March at this point, so all eyes are turning to the sport. It's a very fun time.
It is such a fun time.
The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. This is a free service that strives to be three things. 1, valuable. 2, concise. 3, entertaining. Every Saturday, I send out a curated list of sports betting tips and analytics. In addition, you'll get my March Madness cheat sheet that makes it drop dead easy to fill out your bracket. To sign up for free, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for better March Madness bracket advice. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com.
In the offseason, you actually wrote a great article about team building. You talked about a very important piece of success is that you really ideally want 50% of your minutes going to people that have come back that played last year. So if that really is the key, how do we explain what's going on with both Michigan and Duke this year?
So basically the article was kind of trying to dissect in this modern transfer portal era where you can get players from a lot of different avenues. You can recruit them from high school like people have been doing for years, or you can get them from the transfer portal, or you can try and, kind of the term now is re-recruit your own players because it's not a given that a guy will stay with you for 4 years. And so basically trying to look at all the data based on how the different strategies teams have taken in the last several years when the transfer portal has really changed the way that rosters are built and look at, okay, what actually is the best way to build a title-winning championship caliber squad. And basically there are 3 conclusions. The first conclusion is the most important, but the least surprising, and that is just get the most talent possible. And so outside of anything else, getting more talent is always good. You always want to get a more talented player than a less talented player. And so, it doesn't really matter where that player comes from. If he's good, then you're cooking. But outside of that, when you're comparing teams who have comparable roster strength, roster talent based on the players they've amassed, but you're looking at teams who have mostly guys who have been on the team in the previous year who are coming back versus teams who are mostly retooling and getting new players, be that from the portal mostly or sometimes from the high school ranks. What you're seeing is that when you have comparable roster talent in these 2 scenarios, the teams that are having at least half of their minutes in that season coming from guys who were on the team in the previous year are outperforming most of the time the teams that have mostly return or mostly new players filling those minutes. And so when you actually look even at how this has played out so far this year, I looked at teams in the preseason who I had ranked as having top 75 rosters based on just the roster talent, regardless of where that player came from. And when you look at those teams and how they're performing now, for all of the teams who have a majority of their minutes coming from returners, they're on average meeting expectation, and 23% of the time they're exceeding expectation by a large margin. But when you look at teams this season who have mostly new faces who are filling those minutes, almost half of them are falling short of expectations in a significant way. And so there are always going to be outliers to this. You look at teams this year like, teams who have mostly new rosters. Louisville has been awesome. West Virginia has overcome a lot. Illinois is one of the most talented teams in the country, and they've been good. Memphis has been good. But there have been a lot of key teams like Arkansas, Kansas State, Rutgers, even Michigan. Michigan, is a really strong team this year, but their roster talent on paper was top 15 in the country coming into the year, and I only have them barely inside the top 30 right now in terms of how they're performing and how they're predicted to do going forward. So again, there's always going to be teams that don't meet these criteria. Duke is one of these teams where it's like, hey, yeah, only 23% of their minutes this year are coming from returning players, but their talent is better than any other team in the country. They have the most talented roster. So it's not a surprise that they're still, one of the best teams in the sport.
Absolutely. My numbers really like Duke as well. I have no doubt that they have the talent. I mean, it looks like all 5 of their starters are going to the NBA. I certainly believe that they are a contender. Maybe tell me a little bit more about Michigan, because I would have been surprised coming into the season knowing that their talent rating was 15th in the nation. Seems a little high to me.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that had to do with that my transfer portal evaluations and player projections for this season were really high on both Vlad Golden and Danny Wolf, who have been kind of the fulcrum of what they've been able to do this year. They're both over 7 feet tall, and they're running this really unique offense where Danny Wolf can kind of run the point for them, and Vlad Golden can be lethal on that pick and roll because Wolf can make plays kind of with his length and size that a lot of other point guards can't, and so. And Trey Donaldson, I think, was a very underrated piece for them this year as well. So, on the basis of that, I'm sure there can be different evaluations across the board on their roster talent. So maybe mine was a little bit higher on them than others, but by and large, I think what Dusty May built was getting pieces that not only were individually good, but were going to work well as a collective, and obviously getting a guy like Vlad Golden to follow him from FAU was a big piece because he was arguably their best player, their most efficient player. And so having him kind of as a foundation of, hey, I know what this guy is, I know how to build a game plan around him, has worked really well for them this season. And I think at points this season, they have been more in that top 15 discussion of, teams capable of making a Final Four run. It's been a little bit rougher in kind of the January, February months, but I still think they're one of the most uniquely built teams to kind of have an angle that no other team is going to have. And they have a way of playing that when they're playing their best, it's really hard to stop them because not a lot of other teams are kind of built to hang with the way that they run their offense.
Interesting. Would you say, you said you had them 15th in terms of talent in the preseason. You have them closer to 30 when you're looking at numbers from this season. Would you say they're actually underperforming and we can expect better?
Yeah, I would say that if I had to pick, I think the early season version of Michigan is probably closer to the truth. And what you'll see in a lot of kind of once we get to March is that teams often kind of revert often back to sort of preseason expectation for this team, especially based on the talent they have. So if they've been underperforming based on their roster talent so far in the season, they're more likely to kind of outperform their seed when they get in the tournament, and vice versa. If you've been really outperforming and you have a great season with a squad that shouldn't have been this good, it's a little bit harder to kind of meet expectations based on where your seed is in the tournament. And so I think Michigan is one of these teams where, no, they're not going to have like a top 4 seed in the tournament. But you're looking at teams kind of as a dark horse candidate to make a deep run. I think they're going to be, just as qualified as any to kind of be in that discussion.
Excellent. So in 2025, in terms of this roster building, there's so many changes with the transfer portal. You still believe in what the result, like you believe in the results of the study that you did, right? Like is that's how you would inform if you were a head coach, like you wouldn't just go out and get all transfers, you wouldn't just recruit all freshmen. With the changes that what John Calipari has done, you would search for that mix.
I think there's different camps that a team can fall in, right? If your team is awful, I do not care about keeping your players if you need to upgrade. So for a team that was really bad, like Louisville last year, Pat Kelsey comes in as the new head coach. He did the right thing in not keeping any of those players. They were not great, and there was not really any real ball players on that squad last year. So for Louisville to completely retool their roster for the portal was absolutely the right approach. But when you're talking about a team that's already kind of in that like top 25, 30 discussion from a previous year, and then you're looking at saying, how can we get better this upcoming season? I think one of the priorities should be trying to keep the key players from your squad last year who still have eligibility remaining, as opposed to letting them walk and trying to replace them with a kind of like for like talent. Because a lot of times the new piece won't gel as much as the previous piece that you had if they're kind of similar skill. So that is really my angle here, is saying, hey, always chase better talent. But when you're talking about guys who are already good enough on your existing team, try as hard as you can to keep those guys. And furthermore, if you're recruiting guys from the portal who are maybe, earlier in their college career, like a sophomore, junior, try and look for guys who are more likely than not to buy in and want to be there for multiple years, because oftentimes these transfers have their best year in their second or third year with the new program. We see this right now with Florida. Florida right now is led by a trio of guards in Walter Clayton and Will Richard, who have been with the program for multiple years now. And it's really in their second or third season that they are excelling and kind of reaching their potential. And then you add in a couple other key transfers to kind of lift your talent from last year, and it's working out perfectly for them. Same thing goes for Auburn. Same thing goes for Houston. They're only adding a couple key pieces, and they're by and large returning all of their main players from the year before. That's certainly what we saw from UConn the previous 2 years. And so I really think that is the recipe going forward right now for building a title winning squad.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. Florida's one of those teams that I wanted to ask you about. It certainly fits into what you've been talking about. Are you surprised that Todd Golden has had this kind of success, or did you think, coming from San Francisco, a lot of success there, that he would have been able to do this in only his third year there, like having a really solid top 5 type team?
Yeah, I think in this day and age, you do not give coaches a like 4 to 5 year leash anymore. You can really evaluate a coach really within a year or two, because there are some coaches who are able to have success in year one just because of the portal. So for a guy like Todd Golden, he's obviously one of the smartest coaches, one of the most innovative coaches in the sport. I've had no doubt that eventually it was really going to click for them. I think we saw flashes of this last year, where I think they came into the tournament as a 7 seed, but their one side of the ball was good, and like their offense was good, their defense was not last year. But you saw in the season last year, they played some of their best games, their best performances were against elite competition. And so they showed last year they were capable of being at the top of the sport. And I think this year it's finally clicked, where like you have these key returners in Clayton and Will Richard and Alex Condon, who's been made a big step up from his freshman year last year. You add a couple key pieces for the portal, and now they have one of the most balanced squads in the country. I have them 4th in the country in terms of predicted strength going forward, top 10 offense, top 10 defense. And you're also getting, production out of not just your star players, but guys like Thomas Haug, who is arguably the best player coming off the bench of any team in the sport right now. His impact on their performance on the court has been tremendous. And so I really like their depth and their pieces. And so, yeah, to me, not super surprised that it's clicked. Obviously, it's been a little bit better than probably even most Florida fans could have hoped for this year, because they've just been really outstanding. But grand scheme of things, not super surprised that Todd Golden would have them kind of in this form really this early in his tenure at Florida.
Excellent. evanmiya.com is your site. You have a lot of player ratings and team ratings. Please let us know how you calculate the player and the team ratings.
So yeah, a lot of what I do is built on the player sort of evaluation side of it first. So I have this metric called Bayesian performance rating. And in my opinion, it is the best way in college basketball of measuring the value or impact on a per possession basis that a player is bringing to their team on the court. It looks at your individual stats. So how efficient are you in your shooting, rebounding, and all that stuff. But it also looks at when you're on the court, how are you impacting your team's performance on offense and defense on each possession. And so it allows for you to not only have highlight guys who are, the potential All-Americans, score over 15 points per game, but it also allows you to highlight guys who are, not necessarily going to be your leading scorer or even second or third leading scorer, but they are doing all the other secondary things well that you really want from a player, like playing good, impactful defense and, setting screens and things like that. It allows for you to evaluate, hey, is this player having an impact, a positive impact when he's on the court, regardless of whether he's scoring 25 points per game or 5 points per game. And so that's why when you look at the top 10 right now in Bayesian performance rating, Cooper Flagg is 1, Janiah Broome is 2, big gap after them. That's not surprising. You have other guys like Zakai Ziegler and Cam Jones who are in that top 10, who are in that All-American discussion. But then you have guys like Thomas Haug, who I mentioned from Florida, who is at 3, and Joseph Tugler from Houston, who is at 4. Tugler right now has the best defensive BPR of any player in the country, and that's because Houston arguably has the best defense in the country. And when Tugler is on the court, he is basically, they're playing at the absolute elite level that they can. He's an incredible shot blocker. And when you also look at the on-off splits in terms of how Houston's defense is performing when he's on the court versus on the bench, he's just elevating their performance further. And so he seems to be the key cog this year to making Houston as good as they are defensively. And so, yeah, he's not an offensive elite threat, but the defensive value is unquestionable this year. And that's why he's ranked really highly in this metric. And so then when you talk about the team rating side of things, a lot of what I do builds off of the overall evaluation of your roster strength and then looks at, okay, during this season, how has your team performed in terms of the offensive and defensive efficiency numbers that we often talk about in the sport. But it really starts from the player level first of saying, how good is your roster? And then how has the team performed above or below expectations so far this year? And using all of those factors to then predict not just how good has your team been this year, but how good are you going to be going forward?
Excellent. Right. Because I remember the last time I had you on, you definitely talked about how the team is built off of the player ratings. Just a quick question about the player ratings. You did mention something about like it measures the impact of a player setting a pick. I mean, you're not going into that kind of like video level analysis, right? Like you're getting that, you're inferring that from the box score and from the plus minus that you get when a player is on or off the court, right?
Yes, that's correct. I have worked in my previous job. We actually did for NBA teams go to that level where we're actually evaluating how much value you're adding based on different sort of non play by play tracked things like screens and cuts and stuff like that. But no, basically it's more just saying if you are doing all the right things that your coach wants from you, regardless of whether that's shooting the ball and getting those counting stats that we often talk about in terms of points and rebounds and assists, or whether it's all the other off-ball stuff that really just leads towards better team performance. If you're really having a good impact, it's going to show up in terms of how the team is performing when you're on the floor. And it does adjust for the quality of all of their players on the court for every single possession as well. So if you're always getting put in to guard the other team's best player, you're going to get more credit defensively than if you're always in the game against the other team's bench unit, for example.
So you do have data on when a player is guarding the opposing team's best player?
More just in terms of like who's on the court for each of those possessions.
Okay. Excellent. And so you have these defensive and offensive ratings. Do you blend that in with like your kind of preseason talent rating that you were telling us about earlier before you put it into the team rating?
Yeah, so all of both my player and team ratings still keep a level of preseason prior in them the entire season. Now, that's not necessarily the most fair way to evaluate like who are the most deserving teams to be in the tournament, because you just want to evaluate body of work this year, which is totally fair. But when we're talking about leading to the best predictions of future success, even late in the season in March, I've still found that keeping some preseason information in the model, both on the player level and the team level, does a much better job of actually predicting where a player or team is going to perform going forward. And so for both the player ratings and the team ratings, there is still a level of preseason prior built in. So for example, Cooper Flagg right now is number 1 in BPR. He would not be number 1 ahead of Janai Broome, if not based on the fact that part of why his rating is so high in terms of predicting performance going forward is because we know that he is this high level talent coming out of high school. If he were a no-name 2-star player who Duke was just somehow randomly playing all these minutes and he was performing this well, he would still be ranked really highly, but he wouldn't be number 1 in terms of predicted value going forward.
And you probably have something beyond that Cooper Flagg was a 5-star, right? Like there's something in there that he's projected to be the first pick in the NBA draft.
Yes, correct. Yep.
Was excellent at the Summer Olympics, when he first started making a name for himself in those practices, right? As a high school kid against all those NBA stars heading over there. So there's some of that too, right?
Yeah, the freshman angle is mostly based on your kind of consensus recruiting profile coming out of high school. But for a guy like Flagg, and I often have cases like this where when you're talking about the top 2 or 3 guys coming out of high school, there is a big difference between Cooper Flagg being the best freshman in the sport coming into this year and like Isaiah Collier being the number 1 freshman at USC a couple years ago. So you do have to kind of handle those cases specifically based on like, hey, where is this player really being talked about in terms of NBA future? Because that often does tell a lot about, hey, this guy might be the best freshman in the sport this year, but he's still going to be like barely in 3rd team All-American kind of caliber player. Whereas Cooper Flagg in the preseason was not only talked about as being the best potential number 1 pick we've seen in years, but already kind of in the 1st team All-American conversation before he'd even played a single second of college basketball.
I think it's a little controversial with kind of non-analytics people that you would still be using a preseason prior at this point in the season. It's not controversial with me. I've definitely seen that in college basketball, in the NFL work that I do. And yeah, it definitely leads to better predictions, right? So I applaud you definitely for doing that. I want to talk a little bit more about Joseph Tugler. This guy, he's part of Houston's team. You already mentioned how good he is and the impact that he makes on the defense. I believe he's got like a 7'6" wingspan and just blocks a ton of shots on a team that probably without him still might be the best defensive team in the nation. Um, is that kind of what you're seeing with his play?
Yeah, he has really unlocked. I mean, Houston has been really solid defensively for years, but he has really this year been the key, in my opinion, to their defense being so elite. And one of these metrics is not only are his individual like stats well, he's been a block monster this year. A new feature I added to my website this year is having these individual player projections where for all of the kind of usual counting stats like shooting efficiency and rebounds and turnovers and all of that. I actually project for every single player based on their career game log of how they performed and who they were, what the context of the game was and the level of opponent. I predict all of these things going forward for the rest of their career, and then you can compare that to all of Division One. So when you're looking at Joseph Tugler's skill grades, he's 99th percentile in projected block rate going forward. He's 98th percentile in offensive rebounds. As a center, he's 89th percentile in steals, which is crazy. And then when you look at the team impact stuff, one of the metrics I use to measure that is adjusted efficiency margin, which basically looks at when you're on the court, how many points per 100 possessions is your team scoring? How many are they giving up on defense, adjusted for level of opponent? Houston's average on defense is giving up about 82 points per 100 possessions, adjusted for opponent strength faced. Tugler leads the team at about 78. That's also best in the entire country. So when you look at every single player and how their team is performing defensively when they're on the court, adjusting for opponent, Tugler is number one in that category. So all of those things kind of go into him being the number one defensive player on my website, and that's predicting value on the court on a per possession basis going forward.
Yeah, and he's really a joy to watch there too. He is a big guy. I mean, would you even consider him the most important player on that team, on a team that has guards like LJ Cryer and Emmanuel Sharp?
Yeah, if you're making an argument about who the most important player for Houston is, you could probably make an argument for Jawan Roberts being in the conversation, LJ Cryer. But really, Houston has kind of the way that they have their MO for years has been greater than the sum of its parts, and we don't just need one guy in order to be great. And so I truly believe that when you're looking at their top 5 or 6 guys, like any of them can have a down game on either end of the court, and this team still isn't going to massively drop off. And so we've seen games this year where Jawan Roberts has been the guy kind of leading this team to a victory. We saw him kind of be the main force in their comeback win against Kansas earlier this year. LJ Cryer went off this weekend against Iowa State. And then you have other games when it's like, hey, the offense isn't clicking, but their defense is stifling, and it's because Joseph Tugler had like 6 blocks. So, I don't necessarily know if I'd pick out, and Milos Usen, I haven't even mentioned him. He's their new point guard transfer from Oklahoma this year. He's gotten better and better as the year has gone on. So, in terms of like most indispensable player, Tugler for me is for sure that on the defensive end. And you could argue, as the team as a whole, he might be their most important piece if he's missing because their defense is just going to go down a level. On the offensive side, though, there's probably 3 or 4 guys who would be kind of in that conversation because they have a lot of different ways they can go there.
Absolutely. We've talked a little bit about Duke and Houston. I think you would consider them primary teams that could win this tournament. Can you give us a surprise team that could possibly win the tournament?
Yeah, my surprise team, if I'm picking a team kind of outside that top tier of Duke, Houston, Auburn, Florida, Alabama, those types of teams, Texas Tech is not only one of the best teams in the country this year, but they're one of my favorite. I have them ranked 5th right now in the country in terms of predicted strength going forward. And part of that is this team is one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the entire country this year. They have so many different weapons, and then they have an absolutely dominant interior presence in JT Toppin, transfer from New Mexico, who has kind of entered first, second team All-American conversation the last couple weeks because he has been absolutely incredible down the stretch. I think he has an argument to be probably one of the most impactful transfers we've seen this year. So when you have a big guy inside, which is often a hallmark of a lot of good college basketball teams in this day and age, and then you have several players on the outside who can make shots and make plays, this team's offense is really fun, and their defense has really taken a step up too, where they have a top 5 offense and a top 20 defense. So I have this team ranked 5th, and I think that they're going to be very underseeded in the tournament compared to how good their actual team is. And so I think they're going to be a very popular pick to kind of outperform their seed line in the tournament. If I'm looking at another team, kind of in my top 10 that I think is maybe being a little bit just kind of slept on, is Michigan State. There are a lot of good teams in the Big Ten this year. Certainly Michigan and Purdue and Maryland have a lot of really interesting things that make them really fun to watch. Michigan State was not one of these teams that we came into the year really thinking was going to be kind of at this like best team in the Big Ten level. And they don't have a like go-to player. They have four really, really solid guards. I think last I checked, their 4-guard tandem is the best in the country in terms of all of their guards being above a certain threshold in BPR. It's better than any other team. But they don't have one single guy who jumps off the page and is like, that's their key player. And I think that's part of why not more people are talking about them. But I really, really like them. Obviously, Tom Izzo is incredible in March. And so I'm also thinking that Michigan State is going to be one of those teams that I'm going to be pretty high on going into the tournament.
Evan, have you done any work on, whether it's better to have your scoring kind of distributed, or do you need like a go-to guy to get you a clutch bucket, like a Luka Doncic equivalent in college basketball?
I have not, and this has been kind of an area I've wanted to research. I think one of the most common sort of talking points when it comes to tournament success is people often talk about you need good point guard play, that a team that doesn't have a good point guard often struggles in the tournament. I don't actually know if the data backs that up or not,
right,
but I certainly know that that's an area that of all the positions, people really point to the point guard as being the one key to tournament success. When you think about even just the last couple years, like UConn has, like, last year was a very balanced team in terms of scoring. You had multiple different guys like Cam Spencer and Donovan Clingan and Steph Castle, Tristan Newton, who all were capable scorers. And so I think I like it when you have a team where you're not overly reliant on one player, just because you have more ways to win if the other team just like has a great scout and a way of taking that player away. That was part of why I thought Tennessee was a little bit capped last year, because Dalton Connect was one of the best players in the sport last year. He was one of the most fun offensive players to watch, but their entire offense just collapsed when people took Dalton Connect away. And ultimately, I thought that it kind of capped their ceiling, and they still made an Elite Eight last year, which I think was really impressive. But when you rely so much on a single player like that, it does kind of limit what you can do across a 6-game stretch when you're playing better and better teams every single game. So, obviously having a go-to player is important. And when you have a guy like Purdue last year in Zach Edey, he was such a unicorn that it was like really hard for anyone to stop him. But then again, like UConn took away the rest of their team, and then that was kind of all they had. So in general, I kind of lean towards the more balanced teams, but you do want at least one guy on your team who, if nothing else is working, you can give the ball in his hands and he can get a bucket. So I think it goes both ways.
Love it. Evan Miyakawa, thank you so much for joining me on the Football Analytics Show, or talking college basketball. Please let everyone know what they can get at evanmia.com.
Yeah, so evanmia.com, if you've not been there before, it's got a lot of different stuff. Player ratings, team ratings, game predictions, matchup previews, lineup analysis, which is used by a lot of different coaches for kind of optimizing the lineups or duos or trios that they're playing during the season. During the transfer portal period, a lot of my stuff is widely used by coaches and people in the media alike for evaluating players in the transfer portal, and there's a lot of cool new tools that I've added this season for that. So there's different subscriptions you can sign up for based on what level of data you want to get into, but there's a lot of stuff free as well. And all my links to all my social media platforms are also on there. So evanmia.com is the place to kind of find all that stuff.
Awesome. So you have the basic, which is $5 a month, $30 a year. What kind of person is going to need that?
Yeah, it's basically the basic tier kind of gets you into a lot of the seeing all the game predictions and getting all of the first level of lineup analysis, where you're seeing for a given team how every single lineup has performed so far this year, adjusted for opponent, or even looking at 2, 3, 4-man lineups. And so really just a lot of people who are like ready to take that first step into getting access to interesting college basketball analytics data. That's really a very popular tier for that kind of person.
And then the premium, you have $30 a month. I presume that's more for like teams that are looking for advanced scouting analysis type.
Yeah, I've definitely built
data.
a lot of the stuff at the premium level for either kind of teams or like very advanced sports bettors who are using it for that kind of thing. There's on the sports betting side of things, for every matchup preview, I actually have a breakdown of how individual factors go into my final like prediction for a game in terms of the spread. So you can see how much home court is worth. You can see how much individual injury adjustments are for each team. As well as updated injury reports for every team, which has been a really cool feature. And then on the team side of things, the individual player projection stuff that I mentioned, that's all premium. You can also, there's a tool where you can actually put any group of 5 players in a lineup and predict how good that lineup would be based on not only if that lineup is played together, but it doesn't have to have played together. It could be players from different teams. It'll actually tell you the predicted lineup strength in terms of offensive and defensive efficiency and all of the strengths and weaknesses of that lineup in terms of predicted 3-point shooting and rebounding and turnovers and all those things, which is going to be very popular for teams kind of evaluating how they're building their rosters during the offseason, because you'll be able to see like not only, hey, this guy's good, but how does he fit in with these other guys, and where will that give our team kind of strengths in terms of different areas. So all those things kind of built for both coaches. I mean, it's mainly coaches, but in reality, a lot of just really hardcore college basketball fans use it too.
Evan Miyakawa, thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Evan Miyakawa as much as I did. Just a reminder, you can get my free sports betting newsletter and my March Madness cheat sheet that makes it drop dead easy to fill out your bracket. Check that out at thepowerrank.com. We will continue with college basketball over the next month as we head into the tournament. I will talk to you again in the next episode.